So let's start off with a word of prayer. Thank you, Lord, for our time this morning, that we can search your creation as we look around what we have today, and we can see your handiwork in each one of us, in each one of them. Help us to continue to learn and bolster up our belief in faith that you did make everything, and you continue to keep it that way, Lord. We know that there was ruin, it was destroyed by water, but we're waiting for the next time when you summon and destroy it with fire. Look at the prayer requests today. Help those who are suffering, if they continue to search for you, and help us as we continue on today. That we hear what you want us to hear. Thank this in your name. Amen. Okay, Dell is in here again, but we're going back to Dell. Dell's back, and Steve Austin is going to be bringing us both of them today. Sort of back to the rocks, which I'm comfortable with. So let's see what he has to say. I believe I shared everything.
Steve, it looks like we're overlooking a lake down there, but it's not like any lake I've ever seen. What has happened here?
This is Spirit Lake, north of the volcano. At 8:32 in the morning on May 18th, 1980, a giant earthquake occurred under the mountain, dislodging the north slope, and the mountain collapsed into the lake.
So the debris from the mountain came into the lake?
Came into the lake and deposited on the bottom of the lake about 200 feet of deposit. Simultaneously, it pushed the water of the lake up onto the north slope here. And we see on the north shore and the slope this gigantic scour deposit. So the landslide debris lands in the lake, pushes the water up 860 feet above the pre-eruption level. There is scour on the slopes of Mount Margaret. And then it went around in a circle in this basin right here and created this kind of scour vortex.
And that scour vortex is what brought all that timber down into the lake?
Yeah, so the logs that are in the lake were growing up on this slope.
So we had a forest here before the explosion?
Yes. Over here in the blowdown area, the trees were just blown over. But in the scour zone, the water scour zone, they were actually ripped loose from the surface and they landed back in the lake.
That gives you an amazing picture of the power of water.
Yes, the power of water to erode a landscape is right here. We can see grooves and furrows, and you can actually see the vortex where the water went around in a circle to make this basin in front of us. If it can do it here, could it do it on a larger scale, like on a global flood? What would it do? Water is able to sculpt and bevel rock with ease, and that's what we see here, and that's what we can imagine on a larger scale during a global flood.
So what we see here is just a small part of what massive water can do compared to what would have happened in a huge global tsunami.
Yes, and this is a scale model, a little living laboratory for the study of catastrophic erosion of bedrock.
Steve, these logs have been floating for, what, about 35 years, right? What have you seen over those 35 years in terms of those logs and how they float and the action of all of them?
The logs, of course, float, most of the logs float horizontal, prone on the surface of the lake, and then they sink. But we've been trying to watch how they sink to the bottom. Half of the logs have been redeposited, and so what we discovered is they float upright at the surface. The root end of the log usually gets soaked with water, becomes heavy, and sinks, but they float in upright position. Then we noticed that they fall and disappear, and they stand upright on the bottom of the lake. When I did my diving at the bottom of the lake, discovered large logs with root mass flaring out at the bottom of the lake, just standing there as if the tree grew there in the bottom of the lake, but it didn't. It grew on the slopes up here. The log was ripped loose by the water wave. It It floated on the lake a little while, probably prone, and then went vertical, and then finally fell to the bottom and replanted in the bottom of the lake. We did a sonar study of the bottom of the lake. So we had sonar contacts with hundreds of upright logs on the bottom of the lake. There's evidence, if we extrapolated the bottom of the lake, maybe there were 10,000 logs standing vertical. What would Spirit Lake look like if you drained it? It would look like a forest that grew there. But no, it didn't grow there. It's been replanted. And the implications of that are enormous.
Steve, do these logs sink at the same time or at different times?
We've been watching the log mat here for 35 years, but we've discovered that all the different species of forest logs do not float with the same duration. The first logs to be deposited were the noble fir and the silver fir. And we noticed that they didn't survive very long in the floating log mat. But the Douglas fir, they continued to float, and they're the resin impregnated logs that are today on the surface of the lake. Almost 100% of the logs, now 500,000 logs that are floating there, are the remaining Douglas fir logs. The other logs have fallen, and the Douglas fir start falling out. So if you think about the bottom of the lake, there's a whole bunch of standing redeposited trees, and they've been deposited in species stratified layers
Over time.
over the years.
So, Steve, we have these trees that are sinking at various times, sediment layers laying up.
And different types of trees sinking
and
at different
Yeah.
times, okay?
So, let's say 300 or 400 or 500 years from now, Spirit Lake is gone and someone is trying to analyze what happened here. What would it look like?
It might look like a series of forests that grew one on top of another. Isn't that the natural way to think? Here's the forest growing here today. There's the ancient forest that grew there on the flatland thousands of years ago. You know, that would come naturally, wouldn't it, if we saw that? And seeing a species stratified deposit on the bottom of the lake, yeah, that would imagine climate change and an ecological succession of forests, something like that.
And that sounds a lot to me like what I used to see in Yellowstone Park, Specimen Ridge.
Now at the Yellowstone National Park at Specimen Ridge, there's a sign, or was a sign, that talked about the petrified forests, and there's 27 different layer levels superimposed on one another. Each one of those was thought to be an independent or a succession of forests, one on another. And the study of the log mat here at Spirit Lake has helped understand the layers buried in mud flows there at Yellowstone. And the very beautifully petrified sequoia trees that are standing upright don't have radiating root mass. They're not sitting on soil. There's all kinds of interesting tree ring correlations between logs with root ends at different levels, arguing that the trees all grew at one time and were buried in the successive layers. So that reminds us almost immediately.
So what we see at Specimen Ridge in Yellowstone that has for years and years been viewed as a long succession of different forests is very similar to what we're seeing here.
Yes, and so Mount St. Helens provides a laboratory for studying how species stratified logs get buried and could be petrified, like at Yellowstone. So Mount St. Helens has enormous applications to geology elsewhere, like at Yellowstone petrified forests.
Well, I'd like to get a closer look at that log mat. Can we go down there and see them?
Yeah, we have a trail down there, and it's a really good way to go.
All right. It's even more impressive when we get down here. All of these logs, they're just incredible.
1 million logs floated on Spirit Lake the day after May 18th. The lake was covered with logs. They thought the lake was gone. It looks like a beach, doesn't it?
It does.
But it's logs floating over deep water.
You know, the thing that I guess I first noticed when I got down here is how these things appear to be almost milled. I mean, they're rounded, they're smooth. what causes all of that?
They floated for years now. 35 years these logs have been floating in this lake. And they rub against one another and they're milled. Obviously, the big observation to make here is the bark is gone after 35 years.
Why don't we see, I mean, all this bark has been stripped off and these logs have been milled. Why don't we see all of that residue floating?
It's obviously waterlogged and soaked.
Uh-huh.
In 1979, I defended my PhD dissertation on the floating mat model for the origin of coal at Penn State University. What I was interested in was how a coal bed in Kentucky formed. And as I studied the coal bed, it became evident to me that it did not grow in place in a swamp, but that the coal bed formed from logs rubbing and making bark falling to the bottom and accumulating sheets of tree bark underneath a floating log bed. That was the model that I defended for my PhD dissertation.
And that was before all this happened.
10 months before Mount St. Helens exploded, I defended my PhD dissertation on the floating log mat model for the origin of a coal bed in Kentucky.
And then all of a
what
sudden
happened?
you had one here.
And right here in my favorite volcano at Mount St. Helens in Washington State, we have a floating log mat for study. Now it became a concrete reality, so I had to go diving and I had to go explore this log mat in this unusual
So
environment.
are you telling me you've been down to the bottom of Spirit Lake?
I'm trained scientific diver, and I've done the dives to the bottom of the lake, up to 100 feet.
And what did you find there?
I'm looking at the bottom of the lake to see what the sediment is like that's accumulated there since 1980. Well, yeah, as you might imagine, it's abundant sheets of tree bark. That's where the logs deposited their bark, is on the bottom of the lake. The water-soaked exterior of the tree rubs against another tree and is peeled off. Water-soaked, it swells, it sinks to the bottom, and you build up this thick, spongy layer of plant material called peat. But it's formed underneath the floating log mat.
Was it a thin layer, a thick layer? How thick was it?
Yeah, the organic material that accumulated under the floating log mat was up to 3 feet in thickness and over a wide area of the lake. There was not an area of the lake that didn't have a large quantity of plant material. And the primary plant material is sheets of tree bark. And it reminds me of the coal beds that I was studying in Pennsylvania and in the eastern United States and Kentucky, where abundant sheets of tree bark are found in the coal bed itself. So the plant material that accumulated in the bottom of this lake is very much in the texture and composition like the coal beds in the eastern United States.
So what you're seeing here, does it look like we have the precursor to a coal bed right here?
This is the first step for the formation of a coal bed. We haven't completed the coal bed operation. We need another volcanic eruption to bury the bottom of the lake to make the plant material be compacted to form coal. But we have seen the first step for the formation of a coal bed.
So let's suppose we had another volcanic activity here and we had what would be a mud flow then that might come in and cover it?
Yeah, or another summit avalanche deposit could very abruptly bury this. Or what was down on the bottom of the lake in 1980 that was buried? Could that be coalified sitting down there already?
So do you think that process can produce coal in that short of a time?
I think it can. What we need is burial to squeeze out the water, and then we need a little bit of heat. We don't need a lot of pressure to make coal, but in the laboratory we can make a coal-y-like substance very rapidly in weeks just by compacting the water away and then generating a little bit of heat. Internally, wood generates heat when it's sitting away from oxygen, the idea of the hay in the barn kind of thing. And so, wood can be coalified, and that's known from laboratory experiment.
So all we need is a peat layer, like we see formed right here, another layer on top to provide the pressure, squeeze out the water, and we have coal.
Yeah. My PhD dissertation supervisor my advisor worked on the coalification of wood. And it happens in weeks in the right pressure and temperature situations. Doesn't take millions of years to make coal. Just a little bit of heat and pressure makes the thing happen. And coalification is one of the ways that wood is preserved in the earth, fossilized, if you will. The other way, of course, is petrification, where mineral infiltrates the wood.
So, Steve, what caused you to have such interest in coal in the beginning?
As a kid, early age, I had lumps of coal, and I was always wondering, how did the plant material get accumulated to make the thick, hard mass that's now coal? What was the process like that formed it? As a kid, I was very interested in that subject, and I was looking at the glassy bands running through coal, realizing those are solid plant fragments in coal. What was the story that a lump of coal has to tell?
And what was the story you were told as a kid?
Yeah, as a kid, they told me it took thousands and thousands of years to build up the thick, spongy plant material called peat, which was later compacted in a swamp. And the swamp environment accumulated and compacted to make a layer of coal. Since the organic material in a swamp, a freshwater swamp, is antiseptic, it allows the plants not to completely decay, and you're able to build up this thick, spongy layer of peat. I was told it took about 1,000 years to form an inch of coal. That was the conventional explanation for the origin of coal. And I was out there at Penn State University in 1979 to test that particular explanation for the origin of coal.
And how did you test it?
Did the study of the Kentucky coal bed, and I pretty much disproved the swamp theory for the origin of coal. Well, in the explanation and the process of going through a PhD thesis and dissertation, the university said, you can't turn in a thesis disproving a theory. You need to turn in a thesis proving a theory or generating a new theory for the origin of coal. So don't tell us what's wrong with the old theory for the formation of coal. Generate a new theory for the formation of coal. Well, the day before Christmas, 1978, I was taking a bath, thinking about the plant material, especially the tree bark accumulated in coal and the thick layering in coal. And I was thinking about the root-penetrated, very disorganized structure of modern swamp peats. As I thought about this, I was playing with soap suds and imagining logs floating on an ocean. And I imagined an ocean full of logs, and these logs would rub against one another, and the bark would peel off and sink to the bottom. And that's what I call the floating mat model for the origin of a coal bed. What we see here essentially is the first step for the formation of a coal bed, like the coal beds in Kentucky. And the modern swamp peats are intensely root penetrated and create this homogeneous texture that's quite different than the coal beds that we have in the world today. And those coal beds are better explained by this type of environment.
So, having studied what's going on here, what would you conclude now and help people understand as to how the coal beds around the world might have formed?
I was told that it takes thousands of years to form an individual coal bed and millions of years to form the strata with multiple coal beds. Instead, I think that coal beds and the strata around the coal beds can form rapidly, like in an ocean. And these logs could float around in an ocean with marine organisms, and the logs could be peeled off, bark could fall to the bottom, and thick sequences of plant material and non-plant material like sand and lime sediment could be accumulated to make the coal layers that we see all over the world. And so this log mat environment is a piece of a puzzle that helps us understand the rapid and catastrophic process to form coal and coal-bearing strata. And I think this helps us understand the global flood of Noah's day and even the catastrophic process that was going on a colossal dimension.
So this provides for you a continual lab, doesn't it?
Yeah, so this is a living laboratory for the study of coal formation. And Mount St. Helens just happened to make this laboratory for us to study.
Questions, any discussion? I'm not gonna be able to answer many of the questions, but it's amazing how much they talk about not, how much time they don't take for this stuff to actually come around. I mean, it's not millions and millions and millions of years. It's sometimes it happens really quickly. We talked about it with the stratification or the sedimentation that is laying down. He'll talk about that a little bit more here when we get.
Just shows you how wrong, the top PhDs can be when they make their assumptions and throw it out there as if it's true.
Well, a lot of things that, I was rewatching some of the things from before and about how, like Darwin, in the time, it was millions of years and that's what he was taught. And how he would fit the stuff in that time frame. But if you're looking at it from, everything that happened during the flood and how instantaneous all that stuff was, if you're looking at the facts of what the rocks are telling you, it's totally different. So,
Thought,
sure.
he was reflecting on, what happened, basically the creation. But as he was explaining things, I thought about Revelation 6, where he opened the seal,
Mm-hmm.
and he said, I saw when the Lamb opened the sixth seal, and there was a great earthquake. The sun became as black as sackcloth, made of coarse hair, and the full moon became like blood. The stars of heaven fell to the earth like a fig tree, drops on ripe figs, when shaken by a great wind. The heavens ripped apart like a scroll being rolled up, and every mountain and island was moved from their place. And I just thought about it. He talked about what is it, the rapid catastrophic process.
Mm-hmm.
And we kind of think about, we can almost envision, because we're not right in here,
Mm-hmm.
to see exactly what will happen at that time. And I guess men's heart will fail.
Yeah, it will. In looking back on some of the things like what Danny was talking about during the, how the creation of the stars and the many millions of galaxies that are out there that we can't see. It's his creation. It's God's creation. He's going to do with it what he deems necessary. Like then, he killed every man, woman, and child except for what was floating on the boat from the ark. So, it's his creation, and I'm not going, if you're looking at where we are in all of this, the creation was built for us to see his glory. And that's what we have to see. And it's through these videos that we're going, there's a lot of people doing a lot of work. And a lot of the young kids now, I guess there's quite a few now that are going into this with a mindset of looking at what is actually there and not trying to fit it into the millions of years. Because like I said a couple weeks ago with this, what is their main goal? Why are they clinging to this when they know that it's not that, that we can prove to them by facts and that, the way that they look at how old rocks are and stuff like that, it just doesn't work. We've been through that. Why do they hold to it?
The same way Pharisees refuse to have Christ in us.
Mhm.
They refused to, even when the gods said, yeah, angels came and moved the stone and Christ wasn't there. They still didn't go, oh, maybe we should have thought this. They refused. And refused. They will not accept it no matter what.
Exactly. And, it's to their it's to their detriment, Bruce.
You can imagine, just on another subject, that a relatively small area geographically, all those logs.
Mhm.
Can you imagine every tree on the whole earth
Yes,
on?
at that
Every tree on the
time.
whole earth.
At that time, I mean, I could see where there's a floating mat going around dropping trees during the flood,
Yeah,
but,
the map the size of North America, you know.
and like he was talking before, and he's gonna talk about mud flows again today, that it's still happening under the water. You know, on top of the water, the ark was safe. I mean, they didn't know what the cataclysmic catastrophe that was happening below the surface in this whole thing. I mean, it's just amazing. Did I do that right, Joe? Okay. All right, this one is on the fossils of the nautiloids, and he'll explain what a nautiloid is and how big they actually are here, but he does some experimenting here in the sandbox, believe it or not. So let's see what he has to say here.
Yeah, okay.
How long you been doing this, Steve?
I've been looking for a particular kind of marine fossil called a nautiloid in Grand Canyon for about 25 years. It's taken me along about 100 miles of the Grand Canyon, and I've been finding them all in one layer. So what I do is I go find the layer in the Redwall limestone where they occur, and then I study the fossil content, and that's what we get.
So what is a nautiloid?
A nautiloid is a squid in a shell. It has a cone-shaped shell that has pressurized chambers in it, and the body of the organism is at the wide end of the shell. And the animal could swim really fast.
Oh, that's very cool.
And they're the fastest swimming predators you can imagine.
How big do they get?
Some of these squid-like organisms are up to 1 foot in diameter and 7 feet long.
That's a pretty big creature.
About the average length of these things is about the length of your arm. And there are small ones, medium ones, and big ones.
So you found them out here somewhere?
Yeah, right here in the limestone below us, we can see an excellent display, a typical display of nautiloids. Now, take a look over there. You can see the cone-shaped organism pointing this way.
I see it.
And you can see the curved chambers internal to the shell. That might be originally 4 feet long or so.
Yeah.
And then I see over here, right in this area, and that must be 1 or 2 feet long.
Yeah.
And then I see the tip end of a nautiloid, very beautifully
Oh, that one's
preserved,
cool. Yeah.
with the internal tube down the center. And then I see, it looks like a middle segment of a broken nautiloid with the chambers coming through here.
Yeah.
So there's 4 nautiloids right there.
And what is that? I mean, it looks like somebody drew a circle in the rock.
Yeah, it looks like a circle sitting on the same plane as the other 4 nautiloids. Could that be a nautiloid pointing down?
So it's vertical. It's fossilized in a vertical position.
It is.
That seems strange to me.
Yeah, about 1 out of 7 of the nautiloids that we're finding in this layer are tip end pointing down.
So that's not rare. Do you find that all over?
Yes, and on every location where I see many nautiloids displayed, I'll always see the circle and they're pointing down.
But the rest of these all seem to be pointing in the same direction.
You notice that, isn't that interesting? See, I pointed out 4 nautiloids, and one's pointing this way, one's pointing that way, one's pointing that way, and one's pointing this way. They're all in that general trend running this way across the layer. So what does that argue? It's an aligned condition of fossils.
And what would cause that?
I think that a current swept over this deposit and it aligned them. If these organisms died a natural death and fell to the bottom of a calm and placid sea,
It'd be random.
they would be randomly pointing, and they're not. And so something swept over them and buried them. It froze very rapidly to trap a nautiloid in vertical orientation.
Right, yeah. Well, Steve, the conventional story is that creatures are fossilized, when they die, they sink to the bottom, they slowly get covered up. What is the evidence that you see here that supports the Genesis story?
Well, there's a lot of sediment here, you know, layers, but the nautiloids are all in this one plane of the Redwall limestone. And I've seen it through 100 miles of the canyon. And it
lot of
argues that
fossils.
there must be 1 billion nautiloids around here. And so there's some type of mass kill or death associated with this. And then the bedding surface we're looking at is consistent with that. We see the orientation or the alignment of fossils, which argues that it wasn't a natural death that killed these organisms. They didn't fall randomly to the bottom. Something swept along and moved them. Their bodies maybe still in the shells, and they were buried by being smothered here. So it's a mass kill on a colossal dimension in an ocean current, which brings to mind immediately something like a global flood.
And it seems to me also just the detail, I mean, that one fossil over there, there's just exquisite detail in that fossil. And it would seem to me that if it was a long time, I grew up on a ranch, those things decay and they decay quickly. So these must have been buried rapidly.
Those are really mind-challenging things. So my original thought is they may have been poisoned, but now I'm thinking that they have been smothered alive by this fast-moving current. The fastest-moving predator in the ocean is probably a nautiloid, and it can't survive whatever whomped on it here, some kind of current. So the fossil deposit is kind of a Sherlock Holmes detective story. We're looking here, trying to discern the events that led to the killing and burial of these marvelous creatures.
So all of that evidence seems to point back again to the history we have recorded in Genesis.
Yeah, this is not a calm and placid sea. This is not business as usual. This is something really extraordinary.
So is this a mud layer that's rolling in here?
It could be muddy, it could be very much a slurry. And that's another story that I'd like to tell you.
All right, you lead the way. Well, this is really interesting.
We're looking at the bottom part of the Redwall limestone here in the middle of the Grand Canyon. In the top, we see the thin-bedded, rather brown limestone and chert strata with an abrupt boundary with the thick-bedded limestone underneath it. And that upper 7 feet is the nautiloid bed. And then running right down the middle of it is the coarse fossil zone. And that coarse fossil zone continues for 100 miles down the Grand Canyon. It also goes to the west, out in the Lake Mead area. I've even seen this bed in Frenchman Mountain next to Las Vegas, Nevada, eye level with the Stratosphere Hotel. There's this 7-foot layer. So it's extremely
Very
persistent and extensive, and we're just looking at the general characteristics of it here. So in the middle there is the nautiloid layers with all that coarse fossil
So
material.
that corresponds to what we just saw when we saw the fossils.
So we were looking down on that surface. Now we're looking at it in cross-section.
Well, Steve, I've heard that limestone just takes a long time to form. How do we explain this?
On the Great Bahama Banks, limestone accumulates about 1,000 years per inch, lime sediment and lime mud. And maybe that is some people's thinking about the conventional way, but thinking about this limestone layer here in the Grand Canyon causes me to just jettison that idea almost immediately.
Is there a difference between this and that?
Very much a difference. Remember, the fossils are all along one horizon in the bed. They're not distributed vertically throughout the bed. And then you notice that it's very extensive, extremely extensive, down 100 miles of canyon. And then remember, the alignment of the fossils provide evidence of a current. Together, these three observations need of an excellent and good interpretation. And that led me to do some very serious reflection, and it challenged me to do my best work. And the experiment that I had with my son, February 3rd, the year 2000, in the giant sandbox is worth talking about. With a dad and his kid with the sandbox, it started with pouring sand. And you know, pour sand, it's in friction. When you pour sand fast, it forms mounds. Okay, but when you throw sand, it can stream out over a surface like a blanket.
Right.
And I was throwing out sand with little leaf fragments in it, thinking about nautiloids, when the idea of a high velocity flow came to my mind. Rather than thinking about granular friction, you know, the grains as they bounce along as you throw the grains out, the frictional flow, I imagined little springs between the sand grains holding them apart. And if that could happen, the sand could flow almost endlessly. And my brain entered a domain, I call it no friction land. I started thinking about high speed, no friction flow of sediment slurries, concentrated sediment slurries over the surface of the earth on low slopes and that kind of thing. It led me into a 4-year thought experiment, if you will, about how sand grains and sand-sized particles and large fossils might move. How did the fossils, the coarse fossils, get in the middle of the bed? That is the mind-challenging thing. I could imagine how they could get at the bottom of the bed, just fall out, or I could imagine how they get to the top of the bed, but how could they get in the middle? That was really interesting.
And how'd you figure that out?
Well, I'm thinking about the sand flowing out. I'm looking at those leaf fragments, and I'm thinking in the wake of a high-speed flow, there could be a turbulent eddy, and that's how the nautiloids could fall out with the sediment. Concentrated sediment would fall out first, and then the fossils would be buoyed up, and they would fall out, and then finally the light stuff, the finer texture would fall out. And so it seemed to explain things. In no friction land, I can imagine how this occurred. I worked out the equations in 2D of a dynamic pressure and static pressure on a fast-moving flow. You know, when you have your hand out in the car at 60 miles an hour, you feel that really strong current that's flowing past your hand. That's called dynamic pressure. And a fast-moving slurry, like a mud slurry with lots of organisms in it, would generate that kind of pressure. The faster it goes, the more pressure it develops. When that pressure developed in front is equal to the weight, the submerged weight of the flow, the mud flow, if you will, it causes a property called hydroplane. And in hydroplane, there is no friction with the surface underneath.
Just like what happens on the highway.
Just like what on the highway. So this thing, by its speed, it generates its own cushion, if you will, that makes it detach from the earth. And it flows on a hydroplane.
So all those particles are suspended in their same position and then traveling at a very fast rate.
Yeah. So the boundaries of this thing are high shear, but internally, this thing is very laminar, and it flows along almost endlessly and with low friction. And so I gave it to a modeler, a computational fluid dynamicist, to model that condition. I gave him a couple of months to do the 2D computer simulation. And I remember getting a phone call one day, and I said, "How are you doing on that computational fluid dynamics problem of simulating an underwater mud flow? 50% sediment, 50% water, moving at a speed of about 7 meters per second, 21 feet per second, something like that." And he said, "Wow, they fly." And then he noticed they generated a wing shape as these flows moved under the water, over the sediment surface. They generate a wing shape and they essentially fly. So now we have flying sediment flows on a hydroplane moving over the ocean floor.
And so we can get material then transported very long distances.
Yeah, and very fast. And then the breakup of the wake of this flow creates the conditions that allow the nautiloids and the other coarse fossils to fall out in the middle of the flow.
Is that towards the tail of this then?
The tail of the flow.
Uh-huh.
And so that theory has now been modeled in computer, and it seems to explain the essentials of what this is like.
Well, then everything is happening very quickly.
This sediment sequence can be explained and modeled by computational fluid dynamics very quickly, minutes, not millions of years. So it's a completely different explanation for the origin of limestone layers.
And it's not just the limestone layers. I mean, we've been here in the canyon for a number of days, and it seems like everywhere we look, whether we're talking about the layers all being laid down rapidly, and all the evidence to show that it was a rapid deposition, and then the carving of the canyon, the evidence shows that happened rapidly, all the way down to the mud flows and how those form rapidly. With all of that evidence before us, why do people still hang on to the conventional model?
I think it's not because of the sedimentary evidence, ultimately. I think it's something else. Most people have a high regard for radioisotope dating, and maybe that's the last part of their thinking about millions of years. And so we need to talk about that subject as well.
Well, that's always been a tough issue. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, I have a friend, Andrew Snelling. He's a geologist from Australia who has done some dating on Grand Canyon rocks with me.
I know Andrew. I floated down the river with him, so I'll look forward to seeing him again. Well, before we go, though, we started out talking about the history in the rocks, and these rocks have told us a story.
A powerful story, haven't they? And, you know, the children of Israel were crossing into the Promised Land 1400 BC. And as they crossed the Jordan River, it dried up. And Joshua said, hey, pick up 12 stones, pile these up in Gilgal. These stones will be a monument. And then Joshua said, when your sons and daughters ask, what mean these stones? Ye shall tell them they are a monument or memorial to the great things that God has done. And boy, right here in the Grand Canyon, we have a monument or memorial to the great things that God has done in creation and the flood.
They're memorial to the judgment of God, are they not?
Ultimately, and it's a beautiful world that was judged, and then look at the product for us to study today, and the testimony about the character of God here in the rocks, of all places, the Grand Canyon.
Right. And just like God, he will take the great destruction that is evident here and turn it into something beautiful.
Yes.
That's the grace of God. Well, unfortunately, it's getting late. I'd like to stay here a long time, but I guess we better go.
Well, Del, I'd love to show you many more rock formations here in Grand Canyon.
I would love to see them.
And there are many places with nautiloids. There is the Coconino Sandstone. There is the Kaibab.
Stopped at one spot in the canyon, yeah. "21 feet per second. How fast is that? That's extremely fast.
Fast.
That's mud moving at very, very quick speed. And that's what made all of the sediment things, and it's still doing it on the ocean floor. And then what happened down in North Carolina, some of the places there where the hurricanes came through. Same thing. It happens in catastrophes and whatnot, and moves a lot of product, moves a lot of stuff. I was watching some of the other video with him yesterday, and it, you know, it moves trucks, it moves tractors, it moves some big stuff when it flows in. Nothing. 14.3 miles per hour. 14.3 miles per hour. So, yeah, we saw nautiloids, in the canyon where we stop every now and again, you can see them. Have to kind of water it down a little bit.
Helps us.
Yeah, it does help to see them,
Yeah,
so.
they were showing those rocks, it was sometimes hard to pick out what they were
Yes.
talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, like in here, you could say, yeah, I guess that looks like a nautiloid. I'm not sure. It's not like it's a picture that somebody painted on there or anything like that. I mean,
Those are kind of weathered.
yes, they've been weathered out when they're out and about like that, so. But, I don't know, what do you guys think?
I'm in that cave,
Yeah.
and Nate said, go see if you can find any
Mhm.
fossils, and people are looking around and looking around, finding everything. Finally, someone said, yeah.
Yeah, when you start actually seeing some of it, because once I saw what they first saw, I'm going, oh, yeah, I remember seeing that. Now you can really start picking things out. So, yeah, it was interesting, but I don't know, it just seems like the processes that they're talking about and how they've proved that the Coconino sandstones, like the conventional wisdom says that was all done with above ground sand dunes and whatnot, but because of the difference in the angles, it was all underwater. Because they've taken a look at everything, because remember, I don't know, I know that we've shown this before, but I just watched it again, so they are different on land because it's wind blown. It's more of a 20 to 25 degree angle, but if they're in the water, they're much smaller. It's 20 degrees and less underwater, and that's what all of these angles were. I mean, it's mind-numbing work, but they have to, kids actually go through and they measure them all, which proves that they were done during a flood. So, I mean, and that has fossils all through them as well. So, what else? 20 minutes of video.
Rushing water brings to mind some of those videos that we've seen on the internet of the tsunami.
Mm-hmm.
How it just comes whoosh right on shore, and the destruction that it causes within minutes. It'd be interesting to study the after effects to see if there's anything, in some kind of layers or whatever that got deposited out of because it was maybe left.
Well, yeah, they have done that, and we watched some of it, and they said the difference between that and what happened during the flood is that it didn't, like, when the Hurricane Sandy came to New York and put I don't know how many inches of sediment, moved the sand around and put it up like it was thing, but the problem is that you have these little critters going around, and they're going down and eating everything in its sight and whatnot, so that kind of breaks it all up. Where with the flood, it covered itself with multiple layers and stuff where they couldn't do that. And that's where you have that's how you make fossils, and that they were quickly put, buried to where nobody can get to them. And no natural stuff can get to them that's why there's not many fossils today, because they don't get buried as fast and as deep as they have in the past. So yeah, they've done things, but that's kind of like, just like I was saying about those storms down in North Carolina. I mean, they moved mudslides are the most abrasive things that go through, and you can see that there. If they're on a hydroplane like that, they can move extremely fast and cover things up and make like the nautiloids, like, current was going through there, and they're all put in a row and done like that. So it's amazing. And they said that the reason they study the Grand Canyon so much is because it's so open and it's so dry, and
Been cut out.
it's been cut out for us to study, and it's so dry that there's not much erosion right now. You know, and so. Yeah, it's just. So I'm not sure what we're gonna show next week. I think we might go with the apes. You haven't seen those? Oh, that's pretty cool. They talk about gorillas and how we're not. And that kind of stuff. I think I might show some of those. They're not, they can prove that we're not, well, I mean, if you remember, we talked about the genomes before. And that they said, we are not out of Africa. We did not descend from, we were made in his image, and that is true. Back to the DNA studies, yes. And with that, there is no, in my mind, there is no fight with that. They don't have an answer for it. Like the evolutionists, so. Throughout these whole, movies and stuff, I mean, videos, what do you think? Does this help bolster your faith? You know, I've told you that my faith has always been that God created the earth in 6 days. The seventh day he rested. I believe in the flood and what these guys are showing, what happened there. He had to, because of the evil that man was, he had to destroy the earth with water. Mixed everything up. Used the same materials that was here. There was nothing more he created. He just moved stuff around.
In a big way.
In a big way, in a catastrophic way, and even Noah didn't know about it. I mean, he was safe upon the waters. They're on a boat. That they still use the measurements today to build ships like that. Because it works. So to me, watching these, it just kind of bolsters in what I'm looking at. I don't look, if I go to lecture now, I don't look at it the same as I once did. And I was like, oh, I can see those straight. I mean, even on our property, we have a stream that we call Fossil Creek down there because it's just loaded. It's just shale. And it's loaded with rocks in it and stuff that you can see fossils in it and everything. So even tree limbs, it looks like. So it's just amazing how things change when you can see something like this. Do you understand all that today, Bruce? Well, a little bit. Enough to know it's amazing to see mud like that now. And like they said in previous ones, that it's happening in the ocean now, in a deep ocean. You'll see, they can see mud flows at the bottom, just creating havoc still down through there. And I was watching another video yesterday at some point in time where they say that, the earth is still trying to recover from the flood. So it's kind of amazing to think that there's still things. That's why the glaciers are continuing to melt. So.
We continue to see things going extinct and we don't see anything new, right? Nothing new, what we see is less and less. And that, I was thinking about this the other day, I was talking to Ethan and we were wondering like, how much of God's original creation, plant life, animal life, is still here. We figure 90% of it's probably gone. I'm trying to imagine what the world was like before the flood.
Well, they were saying with the genome part there and stuff, he said there's only so much, with the mutations and stuff that that we withstand. I mean, obviously God can do whatever he wants. He can bring anything back. I don't see him bringing back any dinosaurs.
Yeah, I know that. I mean, he said he's going to make all things new.
Mhm.
So what does that mean? He's going to destroy the world with fire and then he can make all things new again. I mean, makes you wonder.
I mean, what do we
Bring
get?
back the original creation,
What do we get when
Praise it.
Yeah.
when we pass away? We get a new body.
About sin.
Thank God for that.
Yeah. Yeah,
I don't know what the genome looks on that one, but I don't care. You're ready for a new one, right?
You wonder.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. We are.
Real tired.
It's like the old iron, right?
Yeah, it's amazing with all these new facts, you know, the news media hasn't brought it up or anything because the evolutionists, they're out there to prove one thing, that's there's no God.
Mhm. Yes.
And even with all this evidence, they'll just hush it up. And they won't bring it to light.
Yeah, in the final video that we want to show you at the end there, where they kind of tie everything up together and stuff, there's a lot there is no doubt with the facts that they have found. In the rocks that they wanted to go down. It took them 40 years and they had to sue the government in order to be able to do the experiment that they wanted to do. To gather some rocks. I mean, we were told you can't bring rocks out of the Grand Canyon. You can't even take a pebble. And there were some pretty heavy packs on the way out. I don't know, it wasn't mine, but we, it's like, oh, man, this has gotten heavier since. But, yeah, they did a FOIA afterwards, a Freedom of Information Act, to find the emails going back and forth when they were trying to get the permits to do this. And they would say, can you imagine what they could do, these creationists would do with this information? You know, they really didn't want them to be in there.
Spiritual battle.
Because, they finally did, it got up to the national parks in Washington DC, they wanted no part of it, and said, give them the permits. We'll let them do it. And I'm not gonna spoil anything, but they found what they were looking for.
Well, there's a lawsuit from the Dutch about the permit sheriff.
Mhm.
There's a few places along the Grand Canyon on the south rim of that park where they have scripture verses engraved on the wall. Talking about how this. And there's a lawsuit around whether or not those should be allowed in the. And they were allowed in the end, they're the court of it. And I think that helped to pave the way for the.
Yeah.
Geology.
Yeah, and you saw where they had to change the description of what the fossilized trees for the old forests were in Yellowstone. Because Mount St. Helens was an eruption, it was very big. But not near as big as the eruptions that happened in Yellowstone. Yellowstone, I mean, they said they found ash deposits and stuff down in Texas and the beginning of Mexico. So, I mean, and it's still, they said that if Yellowstone erupted, it would be done. It's huge. So, yeah, so they had to change the signs and everything to adjust because of Mount St. Helens and the work that's done there. Because those forests aren't forests at all. They're just trees that were like you had talked about.
Yeah.
Same thing in Yellowstone. So they had to adjust their signs to make it work.
I guess we're gonna have to change the classification of coal to renewable resource names.
Well, he said the same thing about oil and gas production too. That happens in an instant. It's nothing like millions of years that it has to be buried and stuff. It can happen anytime. And we're sitting right now on natural gas, like very plentiful in this area.
Not so wants to stop.
Yeah. Yes. So. But, you know, Lord can't come quick enough. So anything else? Guess we best end out. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the information that we gained today. We thank you for your word. We pray for today's worship that you open our hearts and minds into what you want us to hear today. We ask all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.